friends, welcome back, or welcome if you're new here. My name is Stacy and I am the Chapter Conundrum. And in today's video, I want to talk about my worst and most disappointing reads of 2024. And before I get into that, I also have 2 DNFs to honorably mention and chat about. So before we get into all this, I just want to caveat that just because these are my worst books doesn't mean that they are bad books, that they will be your worst books. Everyone is entitled to their own unique tastes and likes and dislikes when they read. And these things just happen to play into my dislikes. So if what I'm saying about these books and the reasoning behind why they didn't vibe with me doesn't feel like it's something that's going to affect your reading experience, I would still encourage you to try these out and pick them up if you have interest in them. And just so you guys know, before we get into this, I haven't really put these in a definitive ranking. If they're here, they just fall into that category. I haven't said like this one's the worst and this one was just kind of bad, nothing like that. So yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into a couple of DNFs that I had. So I had 2 DNFs this year that were actually because the book just wasn't right for me. And the first one of those is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. And this might be a surprise to you guys, but I DNF'd this about 20 minutes into the audiobook because there was just so much description. My brain could just not. I'm somebody who doesn't visualize while I read, and so heavy chunks of description like this will have me completely zoning out and not really caring about anything. I felt like I was just wading through so many things that I wasn't interested in to get to like tidbits of the plot, and it just wasn't working for me, which is a shame because I am interested in the premise of this and would probably really enjoy the story had it been written with a different writing style. But yeah, it was just way too descriptive for me and I couldn't do it. The other DNF I have to talk about is The Writing Retreat by, I think it's Julia Bartz, maybe? Anyway, I'll put it here. And I DNF'd this one around the 55% mark. And I was kind of struggling with several elements of this that kind of played into why it didn't work for me. I definitely didn't really vibe with the characters. They felt sort of catty and like angsty for their age. And then the writing style didn't necessarily work for me either. It felt like the author was purposefully trying to be kind of like edgy or gritty. It also included dreams, which if you know my taste, I pretty much always hate dreams in my books. I always feel like they lower the stakes. And in this case, they just didn't feel like they connected to the main story very well. It really just felt like they were included to try and make the book more edgy and gritty, which didn't work for me. There were some spooky elements in this book that I was intrigued by, but the further we kind of explored those, they became more like intangible and they just felt wishy-washy. I couldn't really put my finger on like what was happening, what these characters were experiencing. And when I read horror, like I don't necessarily need to know the answers, but I need to have a good sense of what the character is feeling and what they're experiencing. And I didn't really feel like I got that in this book. Further to that, I had some logical complaints here. There's one mention of like a character who supposedly like sleptwalked outside, and the other characters wake up in the morning and they mention that they can see her footprints, but it supposedly snowed like several feet overnight, and they specifically mention that like the snow has blown in up on like the porch stoop. So I'm like, how the heck are you guys seeing footprints if this person sleptwalked in the middle of the night? There was just moments like that where I was just like, this doesn't make sense. And then I found this out in retrospect after I DNF'd because I talked to somebody who had read the entire book, but I had a feeling that I was kind of right on this one, and it turned out I was, that the foreshadowing was just way too heavy-handed. And I'm not going to spoil it for anyone who doesn't know, but there were definitely mentions of things that had me predicting the twist of this like right on the nose. And I just felt like, okay, that was pretty obvious. I'm not sad I didn't finish it. Essentially, all of those things together just kind of built up to me really not having a great time with this one and deciding to not finish it. But some people in the Thrill, Chill, or Kill book club pick, because this was December's read, really enjoyed it. Like Jake gave this a 4.5 stars. So it's just down to taste on that one for sure. So now that I've gotten the DNFs out of the way, let's go ahead and dig into the books that were my least favorite reading experiences throughout the year. And the first one of those that I have is Wonderland by Zoe Stage. And this was a disappointment for me because I had read, I think, Mothered and Baby Teeth prior to this and enjoyed both of those quite a bit. But I ended up giving this one a 2-star rating. And I think mostly it's just that this one happened to kind of delve into magical realism. And that is something that doesn't really work for me. When there's something kind of different occurring, I want characters to react to it and I kind of want it to make sense. And magical realism doesn't really play into either of those kind of elements very well. And furthermore, this is set in upstate New York, which is probably like a few hours away from where I grew up. I forget exactly where in upstate New York this is set. But anyway, the foliage and like the woods and everything are very familiar to me. It feels like homey. And so there was just some things included in here where the characters were like out in the forest, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was just some things that like, okay, this doesn't make sense for somebody who is familiar with this nature. Like the character decisions aren't lining up with what you should know if you grew up here, kind of thing. And I know the premise of this is that like the wife and I think the kids are raised in the city, but the husband in this scenario is like kind of coming back to his roots, so like he should know these things. And it kind of fell off for that reason. But then I also think like the magical realism elements that are present here sort of were kind of in that vein as well. And so I think that's part of why it was extra frustrating for me in this experience. So yeah, sadly, didn't have a great time with this one and ended up giving it a 2-star rating. So my next couple books are book 1 and 2 in the same series, and you're probably thinking to yourself, girl, if you didn't like book 1, what the heck did you pick up book 2 for? But it might make sense when I tell you what they are. And in my defense, I had very different complaints with them, which I expected based on reviews of the second book, which is why I picked it up. So the 2 books I'm talking about are Hooked and Scarred by Emily McIntyre, the first 2 books in the Never After series. And these are very popular in Book Talk. And essentially, Hooked, I gave, I think, a 2.5-star rating. And my main frustration with this one was definitely the characters. They felt very, very frustrating to me. So our female main character in here just felt like naive to the extreme. And she almost had no self-respect. And just like the combination of just annoying traits did not work for me. And then the male main character also was frustrating for me. It almost felt like he was unbelievable and unrealistic. Like he had some trauma in his backstory, but I don't think it really justified like his actions and his attitude and stuff in present day. Like his stuff just didn't feel earned to me, I guess, is a good way to put it. And just to clarify, like I understand that this is a fractured fairy tale and that in some ways these characters are supposed to be kind of like hyperbole of the original characters. It just wasn't written in a way where the character motivations kind of like lined up with the story and they didn't feel explained or really justified. And so it was really frustrating for me to read. But I then looked at reviews for Scarred and realized, oh, a lot of people didn't have, character complaints with this one. So I own it. Maybe I should just go ahead and give it a try. And I did. And the characters in this one were definitely better. But that said, I gave this a 2.25-star rating, so slightly worse than Hooked. But in this one, it was the plot that I just couldn't. I didn't know going in that this was more of like a historical romance vibe. And I think that's part of the reason certainly why this didn't really work for me. I definitely prefer more contemporary type stuff when I read romance most of the time. And there are reasons for that. But yeah, in this one, like this one's based on The Lion King, you had so much you could have worked with in that original fairy tale plot-wise. And yeah, I was just bored in this one. Like I could not, I was bored. So yeah, sadly, these 2 collectively make my most disappointing worst list. I do own books 3, 4, and 5. And because I had very different complaints with these, I'm kind of hoping that if I continue to at least try the series, that I will maybe find a magical combination where she's like changed both of the things that I had complaints about, because she improved on the stuff that I had issues with in book 1 for book 2. So I'm hoping maybe she improves on the stuff from book 2 in book 3. Does that make sense? Am I strange? Yeah, I'll probably give it a roll at some point because I own it, or I'll just let go of deciding to try it and unhaul the series. But yeah, that was pretty much my experience with those. So the next book on this most disappointing worst list I have to talk about is Happy Place by Emily Henry. And this one is definitely my least favorite Emily Henry. And I've read all of her contemporary romances now that are adult. And I gave this one a 2.75 star rating. The main thing that just didn't work for me here was the chemistry between the love interests. So essentially for like, I don't know, so long in the book, at least like the first 50-60%, the only thing these two characters had going for them in terms of like how they had a relationship for 10 years is that they're physically attracted to each other. And like that is, you need more to build a relationship on than that. And it was just very frustrating. And it was funny because the book is very self-aware of that. There's a line in there, I think around page 150, where one of the characters in the romance is asking the other one what they're thinking. And they come out with like, I'll help you out. 99% of my thoughts is just picturing you naked. And I was just like, okay, but I want more in terms of compatibility from these two in order to root for them actually being together and to want them to be together, because like seeing each other as hot isn't going to keep you together for life. You know what I mean? I think the other thing that really frustrated me with this book is that this is a second chance romance, and these characters had like previously been together like 10 years, I think it is, and then they broke up because circumstances like ended up happening that they went long distance and it didn't last, obviously. But the main thing that frustrated me is that like throughout all of like what they deal with on page in their relationship, it's like really basic stuff that you kind of sort out with your person in like the first year of being serious with someone. Like I just can't fathom that these two are together like 10 years and they still haven't worked through these things. Like it just felt so unrealistic to me that it was incredibly frustrating. I also thought that they should have had a lot more baggage with each other than they actually did. Like there was just so many things like that where I was just like, this doesn't logically make sense. It doesn't add up in my brain, and it just did not land for me at all. Emily Henry is usually known for writing like very realistic, complex characters, but I just didn't get it in this one. Like all of her other books, I could at least say, okay, these characters felt unique. They felt like they could be realistic. This one, it didn't work for me at all on that level. Next up, we have to talk about another Thrill, Chill, or Kill book club pick, sadly, and it is The September House by Carissa Orlando. And this one I gave a 2-star rating to as well. So I was actually pretty disappointed with this because the setup and like the first chunk of this book felt very promising to me. I thought I was really going to enjoy it. But after it kind of introduced like the things that I was interested in plot-wise, it very quickly just started focusing entirely on vibes and atmosphere of this haunted house. And I really needed more in terms of like the meat of the plot. Like I wanted answers and I wanted more detail about the haunting situation. I was hoping that these characters would kind of do some research into like the spooky stuff that was happening here. When it really became all about like this character's experience with this haunting, and it became very repetitive about like, oh yeah, this ghost is back again, they're doing the same thing again. Like I just needed more than vibes and atmosphere to keep this one together for me. In the ending of this, we do get some answers and some solutions. They just felt really simplistic to me, and I just felt like it was really a missed opportunity here in terms of being able to tell a complicated, interesting mystery. But you know what? If you're somebody who really likes an atmospheric, spooky book, this might be your new favorite book. So, hey, what do I know, right? If that sounds like it's your jam, pick it up and try it. So my next book is another 2-star read, unfortunately, and it is a sequel that I kind of had mixed feelings on the first book, but this one didn't work for me, and it is Two Twisted Crowns by Rachel Gillig. This is the second book in the Shepherd King duology, so the finale of the series. And book 1 for me worked in terms of the magic system and the fantasy plotline, but in book 2, well, we did have a little bit of expansion to the magic system. It was kind of expanded in one aspect, and then that aspect was like used and harped on and became part of the plot like over and over and over again. So it felt predictable and repetitive to me, which while I was excited that we got more detail on the magic system, it didn't work for me in this case. I also had other pretty big complaints with it. I feel like the main plot line that I was interested in from book 1 really got sidelined for book 2, and we got like a whole other main plot from characters that were more side characters in book 1, and I just wasn't that invested in what was going on with them. it didn't feel like it was as tense or high stakes or big picture like I wanted from the original plot. The romance across the board in the series didn't really work for me, but that was kind of hammered home again in book 2 when we had another romance develop, and I really felt the same way about it. It just felt like it was too insta-lovey, and it just wasn't really earned in a way. Like, I have no idea why these characters are attracted to each other or want to be together kind of thing. It was just frustrating that way. And then even though we did kind of pick up and continue on with the main plot of book 1 in a side plot here, I didn't really enjoy how that all played out either. This is kind of hard to explain without going into spoilers, but I'll keep it spoiler free and just kind of say how I was feeling without giving you the context you need to understand like why I was feeling that way, if that makes sense. So essentially there's an element of this plot line that changes at the end of book 1. And I kind of predicted that going into book 1 based on like the overall premise and some reveals that you get throughout book 1. So I was kind of expecting that, but what I wasn't really expecting is that it kind of shifted the whole dynamic of that plot. So it became a lot more intangible and kind of like you couldn't really get concrete answers on anything anymore. It introduced kind of like new past timeline stuff that I really wasn't invested in because I didn't feel like it was done in a very interesting way for my taste. So yeah, sadly, all of those factors kind of culminated in a letdown experience for me. But I do know that people really love this series, so if it does sound like it's something you want to read, definitely give it a go. The next book I have to talk about is yet another thrill, chill, or kill book club pick. Man, we need to pick better ones, and hopefully we have for 2025. But we got to talk about Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes, and this was, I think, January last year. I can't even remember what I rated this at this point, but I do remember kind of my experience reading it. Like, I was having a decent time reading it for a long time. I was kind of like, I'm liking it, but I'm not loving it. But then we got a big reveal, and I completely hated the reveal. Like, I usually am not the kind of reader where a twist or an answer like makes or breaks the experience. But in this case, it did not land with me. And it wasn't anything that was like offensive. It was just something that I was like, seriously, like that's the answer. And I guess I felt like it was unrealistic for that to be the answer, in that something that felt so simple on the surface could be causing such intricate effects, if that makes sense. So yeah, getting the reveal of this one definitely was very disappointing, and overall it didn't work out that well for me. So that was kind of it for like the category of books that I would say were like my worst reads last year. Now we're kind of moving into the ones that are more of just disappointments. Like, I didn't necessarily hate the book or have as many complaints with it. It was more just like I didn't like it as much as I wanted to or thought I would, maybe, for various reasons. So let's start getting into that. And before I show you what this one is, because it's going to be a bit of a hot take, just know that I love the other books in the series and that this one didn't work for me as well. And I still gave it like a 3 or a 3.5 star rating. But yeah, it's Hero of Ages, the third book in Era 1, Mistborn, by Brandon Sanderson, of course. And yeah, I absolutely love Final Empire, 5-star read. Well of Ascension, I think 4-star read. I still liked it, but it was a little bit slower. And then we got to Hero of Ages, and the plot started kind of going in a bit of a different direction. And I just didn't really vibe with it as well as I wanted to. And because of that, it was just disappointing, because it had previously been like a favorite series that I thought I was gonna absolutely love. And then this one just was decent, but it wasn't great. And I do know that people love this, but I definitely think that this is kind of like more of a personal taste thing. Like, there are elements in here that, again, sort of go what I would describe as like intangible. Like, you don't fully grasp necessarily the concept, or at least I couldn't wrap my mind around everything fully. And it's not even just that it's fantasy, it's just like, I don't know, this is hard to talk about without spoilers, but if you've read it, you'll probably get what I'm talking about. I just felt like some aspects of this could have been better explained for sure. I guess part of it too is like Sandow is usually so logical, and he usually like layers in his foreshadowing and like tidbits to the answers like throughout books. And I think for this one, like it just wasn't as satisfying logically for me. So sadly, it belongs on the disappointing list. I think actually also I can say that this is my least favorite Cosmere book to date. The only other one that I would even question would be Elantris. And I think if I were to reread that now as a more seasoned fantasy reader, I would enjoy it a lot more than I did when I first picked it up, because it was one of the first adult fantasy books I ever read, and I wasn't that used to slow pacing then. And I think my chief complaint with that was kind of like, oh, it was slower paced, there wasn't a ton going on. And I also just thought like one of the POVs had a lot more potential than it did. But also like knowing now that it's supposed to be part of a series, I feel like that potential is gonna come to fruition in the sequel when he eventually writes it. But anyway, I'm off on a whole tangent. I think this is my least favorite Cosmere book, sadly. Yeah. I wanted to love it, guys, but I just didn't. Next up, I want to talk about All of Us Villains. And this is the first book in a duology that features a deadly magical competition. And usually deadly is a buzzword, competition is a buzzword. But without really going into the explanations of why, I didn't necessarily feel like this had those aspects to it as much as I wanted it to. It definitely sets itself up that way, but I think it kind of evolves into something a bit different. And yeah, to explain would really entail spoilers, so I'm not going to do that in case anyone still wants to read it. It was a decent enough book, but it just really wasn't what I wanted it to be and kind of like what I felt it was marketed as. So it was just a letdown in that regard. Next up, we're going to talk about Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Pinborough. And this is a thriller that Jake recommended to me. And if you know about this one, you know that the twist at the ending is very polarizing. But for me, this wasn't like a make it or break it twist. I just wasn't loving the book even before the twist. And the main complaint that I had with this is that it deals a lot with dreams. So here we are again, back to something I usually hate in books, and it definitely was the case in this one. I think that this kind of thing plays into me not visualizing, because when I dream, I don't visualize my dream either. And I think like when books try and sell dreams as like high stakes or tense or just like could be confused with real life, like my brain just does not compute, because that's not my experience with dreams. For me, a dream is very separate from reality because I experience it very differently than reality. And so it's just hard for me to, I guess, relate and grasp like when a character or an author is saying like, this is high stakes and this is tense, because for me it's not. And that I will own that that is totally a me thing, and it's totally a thing with my reading tastes. But yeah, this one just didn't work for me because of all the dream stuff. And I will say that also Jake, I don't think knew that I hated dreams in books when he originally recommended this to me and was curious about what I thought about it. And so when I read it and I was like talking to him about it, he's like, oh yeah, crap, I forgot about that completely. I should have warned you that, oh, I don't think you'll love this anymore now that I know this about your reading taste. But anyway, it is what it is. I didn't hate it. I just wanted to like it because usually Jake and I have very similar tastes and ratings when it comes to most thrillers. So it just was kind of a bummer that this one didn't work for me. Speaking of thrillers I wanted to love way more than I did, we're going to talk about Dark Ride by Ian Robwright. And I absolutely love his horror escape that's set in an escape room. I gave that one 4.5 stars. And so I was hyped for this one. I thought it was going to be a great time and I was going to love it. And I liked it well enough, but I also thought that there was kind of like some things in here that didn't work for me logic-wise. And I don't even remember specifically a lot of detail surrounding why I felt that way. I do remember at one point, like, there are injuries to characters and they kind of like get up and continue as if they're not injured. And so I didn't really feel the stakes of those moments in the book. Like, I feel like as an author, if you're gonna put your character through the ringer, like, let us in on that experience and show us what they're feeling and what they're going through. Don't like tell us that they're injured to try and create tension if you're not gonna like continue to write them as if they have this injury sort of thing. And so that was definitely one aspect of why this one didn't work as well for me. But yeah, I still had fun with the reading experience of this one, and I think I gave it like a 3 point something. But I wanted to love it because his other horror is like so good. So yeah, just a sad disappointment. And then the last book that belongs on my disappointments is Age of Death by Michael J. Sullivan. This is the 5th book in the Legends of the First Empire series. And it's funny, going into the series and just like reading the titles, I was like, Age of Death. Ooh, we're gonna have like tension and real stakes, and there's gonna be death, and I'm gonna be emotionally invested by this point because it's book 5 in the series, and I'm gonna have feelings about this, and it's gonna be bittersweet. And I thought, oh, this is gonna be all the things that I want and that I love. And Michael J. Sullivan usually writes like kind of like happier ending stuff. And so I was really excited to see, okay, what's he gonna do with this, right? And so I just was let down by this because that's not really what this was. This is more like some characters end up in the realm of death, which, you know, should be interesting. But I definitely had some complaints with how it all kind of shook out. In the realm of death, there's like a change to the magic system that we got to know in the world. And because of that change, I just felt like this was much lower stakes. And also this had like a very clear kind of start point and end point based on like the story arc of the second trilogy of this series. And ultimately, because we knew, you know, where this was going to end, or had a pretty good idea of where this was going to end, it definitely felt like it was just part of the journey. Like it didn't necessarily feel like it had its own exciting like climax and resolution and answers. It definitely almost felt like filler because of the way that that story structure all shook out, to me. Not to everybody, but to me. And I think also, like, I had such high expectations, especially because books 2 and 3 in the series do have some of those, like, more dark, bittersweet kind of moments that I don't necessarily expect from Michael J. Sullivan, having read Ryer Revelations. And so just my impressions of what I thought this was going to be based on the title and what I saw kind of like in terms of his writing development from the earlier books in the series, I was so hyped, and it didn't work for me as well as I thought it would because it wasn't what I thought it was based on my impressions of the title. And, you know, part of that is on me. Like, I had impressions going into this and hopes about it based on the title. But another part of it is just kind of like how it ended up being didn't work for me either. So yeah, unfortunately, it was my least favorite in the series and ends up on the disappointment list. So yeah, those were the books that did not work very well for me in 2024. Here's hoping that you guys have found some enjoyment in my ranting or raving or complaining about these books. At least maybe hopefully you've found out something interesting about my reading taste. And whether you agree with that or not, it'll be interesting to chat about in the comments. I need to at some point do some videos discussing like things I really like in books and things I really don't like in books, because I feel like that'll be interesting. And when we get to my best books video, it's going to be funny because when I was making the list, it really didn't feel like something that I would typically like pick up and read. But as I thought about it, I was like, oh yeah, it has this element that I like, or this one has this thing that I like. So it does all make sense to me, but it's very funny up front. But anyway, that's the whole tangent. It'd be fun to discuss that in future videos. Let me know down below in the comments, what are some of your most disappointing or worst reads from 2024? Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you want to on your way out, and have a great day. Bye!